Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever looked into the mirror and flinched, not because of what you saw, but because of what you felt, that uneasy whisper that says, "This isn't who I want to be," and yet, somehow, it is who you've become. The hardest truth we often ignore is this: we become what we hate most in ourselves, not by choice, but by refusal, and today I want to take you deep into the heart of that mystery. The shadow we refuse to face will, without question, lead us. This truth lies buried not in abstract philosophy, but in the marrow of our lived experience. Each of us harbors within the depths of our being a realm that is hidden, obscured by the image we carefully construct for the world. It is that silent chamber of the self where our disowned fears, suppressed emotions, shameful memories, and unacknowledged desires reside. And though we may pretend this darkness is not part of us, it watches. It remembers, it acts. From our earliest years we are taught to wear masks. We learn quickly what parts of us are acceptable and what must be exiled into secrecy. A boy who weeps is told to be strong, so he swallows his grief and learns to smile even when he's breaking. A girl who dares to speak her mind is shushed and called too much, so she hides her fire behind sweetness. These buried parts do not vanish. They merely go underground into the shadow, and the deeper they are buried, the more power they gain. The paradox is that in denying these aspects of ourselves, we give them dominion. In the darkness, unexamined and unchallenged, they gain strength. They do not wait patiently for our return. No, they act. They whisper in our choices, distort our relationships, and haunt our dreams. They emerge in our projections, in the people we despise for reasons we can't explain, in the patterns we repeat again and again and cannot seem to break. What we declare to be not me becomes the very architect of our reality. Consider the man who, growing up under the tyranny of a volatile and controlling father, vowed never to become him. He promised himself he would be different, that he would offer his children the safety and gentleness he was denied. But he never faced the pain, the anger, the fear that was etched into his soul by that experience. He buried it, and the shadow of that unresolved father took root in him, unseen. Years pass. He has children of his own. And though he loves them deeply, he begins to shout when they disobey, becomes rigid when they resist, and watches as they flinch from him, just as he once flinched from his own father. And he is bewildered. Heartbroken, he says, "How could this happen? I swore I'd never be like him." But he became what he did not understand. We all become what we do not reconcile. The hatred we feel for certain behaviors, the contempt we carry for particular people, the judgments we pass without reflection, these are often the trailheads of our own shadow. When we feel an unexplainable disgust or fury toward another, it is worth asking not just who they are, but what within us they awaken. It is not a comfortable question, but it is a necessary one. We like to think of ourselves as whole, unified beings. Yet we are often fragmented, and the parts of us we exile are not content to stay silent forever. They cry out for integration. They do not ask us to become monsters. They ask us to acknowledge that we are not immune to the forces that create monsters. They ask us to admit that we, too, are capable of anger, cruelty, selfishness, envy, that we are human, and in this acknowledgement we find not disgrace but dignity. To own our darkness is not to be consumed by it. It is to become responsible for it. The more we own, the less we are owned. The path to freedom is not in polishing the mask, but in dismantling it. It is in walking into the very places we have been taught to avoid, in naming the shame, in feeling the grief, in allowing the rage to be known without letting it govern us. In doing this, we reclaim our wholeness, and from that wholeness we can live with greater compassion, for ourselves and for others. There is a sacred truth in every shadow. It is born of something meaningful, something once vital that was deemed unacceptable. The shadow is not evil, it is wounded, and what is wounded does not need condemnation, it needs care. It needs light, but not the harsh light of judgment. No, it needs the steady light of awareness, the kind that says, I see you. I will not cast you out. In this way, the shadow becomes not a saboteur, but a guide. Because here's the truth, every time we face what we have avoided, we grow. We become deeper, more real, and we stop being at war with ourselves. When we stop fighting the parts of us we were taught to fear, we open the door to a fuller life. A life not built on performance or pretense, but on truth. But this work is not easy. It requires immense courage. It asks us to confront pain we have long buried and to question identities we have clung to for safety. It may feel like dying, and in some ways it is. It is the death of the false self, the crumbling of illusion, but what is reborn is something stronger, something freer, a self that is no longer fractured. When we do not do this work, when we leave our shadows unexplored, they act out in the world, they shape governments, they divide communities, they fuel violence. What we do not heal within ourselves, we project outward. The wars we wage against others are often reflections of the wars within. And so, if we are to have peace in our world, we must first make peace with ourselves. The man who becomes aware of his shadow gains the power to change the story. He can see when anger begins to rise, and instead of lashing out, he can pause, he can choose, he can apologize, he can repair, he can be the father he once needed, not because he is perfect, but because he is present with all of himself. This is not just an individual journey, it is a collective one. Every time one of us faces our darkness, we make it a little easier for others to do the same. We become mirrors of honesty, lighthouses in a world that too often rewards illusion. And we remind each other that vulnerability is not weakness. It is the beginning of wisdom, so let us not fear the shadow, let us listen to it, let us walk toward it, let us be brave enough to meet what we have denied. For in doing so, we do not descend into darkness, we rise into light, we become whole, and from that wholeness we can begin to truly lead, not from domination or denial, but from authenticity, empathy, and truth. When we gaze into the dark well of our own hatred, we believe we are defending ourselves, building walls to shield us from what we loathe, fortifying the gates against all that we find distasteful, disgraceful, unworthy. We imagine that this hatred is a sword, something sharp and decisive, something that allows us to cut away what doesn't belong to us. But hatred is not a sword, it is not even a weapon. It is a mirror, and it shows us not our enemies, but the unacknowledged contours of our own soul. What we think we are rejecting out there is often what has been cast away in here, deep in the caverns of our own being. To hate is to cast judgment not on the world, but on the parts of ourselves that remain unloved. Hatred is a reaction, not to the existence of evil, but to the recognition of it in ourselves. This is not weakness, this is human. The psyche does not function like a neatly organized machine. It is a living, breathing thing, fluid, paradoxical, layered in its complexity. When we look at someone with disgust, we must ask, what string within me has been plucked? What wound have they touched that I dared not feel? A psychological study in 2014 illuminated this truth in measurable terms. Researchers found that the traits we most criticize in others are often the very traits we have repressed within ourselves. They called this phenomenon projective identification. The person who despises weakness may be harboring a history of pain they were never allowed to name. The one who mocks neediness may have once cried for help into a silence so vast it swallowed their voice. The scorn we heap onto others is often the grief we've hidden from ourselves. This was once the story of a woman I knew. She was fierce, capable, admired for her independence. She had made a name for herself by never asking for anything. Help to her was an admission of failure. And so she came to despise those who leaned on others, calling them soft, calling them fragile. She judged them with a kind of harshness that felt almost righteous, but then life caught up to her, the carefully constructed edifice of her self-sufficiency cracked under the weight of her unspoken sorrow. Depression came, not as punishment, but as truth, and in that collapse she could no longer hide from herself. She needed help. She could not ask, and for the first time she saw her hatred not as power, but as pain. It wasn't that she despised weakness in others. It was that she had never been given permission to be weak herself. This moment of recognition broke her open, and from that breaking came a strange, beautiful thing, healing. She began to see that the people she had ridiculed were not weak, but courageous. They had shown their need. They had asked for presence, for care, for softness. What she had mistaken for failure was, in truth, a kind of strength she had long denied herself. The hatred she had carried for so long had not been directed at others. It had been a cry to herself, a longing to be seen, to be held, to be allowed to be human. So often we live in exile from ourselves. We cast out parts of our psyche as if they are enemies, our fear, our sorrow, our tenderness. We deny our helplessness. We silence our confusion. We bury our need for love beneath a facade of control. But these parts do not vanish. They go underground, and from that subterranean place they speak through the language of judgment, of hatred, of revulsion. But this is not evil. It is suffering in disguise. Hatred is the shadow of pain. It is the soul's way of calling us back to what was abandoned. When we feel hatred rise, we must ask not what is wrong with them, but what is this trying to teach me about myself? Hatred is a trail of breadcrumbs that leads back to the parts of us that were wounded and left unattended. If we are willing to look into that mirror, to stand before it not with aggression but with curiosity, we will see something that breaks our certainty. We will see that we are not divided from the world, but reflected in it. We will see that our enemy is not outside of us, but a memory unhealed within us. It takes courage to look in that mirror. It takes a willingness to step away from righteousness, to dismantle the illusion of moral superiority. But in doing so, we encounter something far more powerful than condemnation. We encounter compassion. Not the soft, saccharine compassion of sentimentality, but the fierce compassion that arises when we see ourselves clearly and choose love anyway. This kind of seeing changes everything. It softens the edges of our world. It transforms our relationships. We begin to understand that the people who irritate us are often carrying versions of our own unspoken stories. We become less reactive, more present. We begin to respond to conflict not with escalation, but with inquiry. We learn to sit with discomfort, to ask it what it needs, and slowly we reclaim ourselves. Piece by piece, we call home the parts of us we once hated. The journey is not linear. There will be days when the mirror is too bright, too painful to gaze into. There will be times when we fall back into the old patterns of judgment, of rejection, of silence. But even then, the mirror waits. It does not punish, it reflects. Always it reflects. To heal, we must become intimate with our own darkness, not to indulge it, but to understand it. Hatred is not a failure of the soul. It is the soul's plea for reintegration. It says, "See me, love me, do not cast me away." And when we answer that plea, not with shame, but with tenderness, we become whole again. In the end, hatred is not the final word. It is an invitation. It calls us to do the hardest thing a human being can do, to meet ourselves in our fullness, and to choose love where fear once lived. If we can do that, if we can stand in the mirror and say, even this part belongs, then we will not only heal ourselves, we will become a healing presence in the world, and that, perhaps, is the deepest power of all. When we peer into the depths of human nature, we do not find a tranquil lake, but rather a storm-tossed ocean, vast, uncharted, and filled with creatures we pretend do not exist. And yet they swim beneath our awareness, exerting their influence in shadows, demanding to be seen. These are not foreign invaders. They are us, our disowned desires, our buried wounds, our silent fears. We push them down, hoping to be rid of them, but what is repressed is not erased. What we deny does not disappear. It waits, it festers, and it returns, not as a whisper, but as a scream. The psyche is not an obedient servant. It is not content to be governed by our convenience or our pride. When a part of ourselves is banished, whether it is our neediness, our anger, our jealousy, our longing, it does not die. It goes underground into the fertile soil of the unconscious, and in that darkness it grows strong, it twists, it takes on new forms. We see it, but we do not recognize it, for we are blind to what we have chosen not to see. Take the young man who carries shame like a second skin. He was told, either explicitly or through 1,000 subtle cues, that to need others is to be weak, that to seek approval is to be small, and so he declared war on this part of himself. He took on the mask of self-sufficiency, carved his identity around stoicism and solitude. He became the lone wolf, a creature admired for its independence, but under the surface a hunger gnawed at him. He found himself compulsively checking his phone, chasing likes, crafting his image to evoke admiration. In public he preached detachment, in private he was starved for connection. He did not kill his need for approval. He merely changed its costume, and so it is for all of us. The parts we disown, the emotions we label as bad, the impulses we judge as ugly, the truths we fear to speak, these are not eliminated by our refusal to face them. They are displaced, and displacement is never benign. The need we ignore becomes the compulsion we cannot explain. The grief we bury becomes the rage we cannot control. The insecurity we hide becomes the arrogance that alienates others. There is a tragic irony to this. We build our lives trying to outrun the very things we carry within. A man ashamed of vulnerability may become domineering, only to find himself isolated. A woman afraid of failure may become a perfectionist, only to find that no success ever feels like enough. We live in circles, constructing elaborate defenses to keep our exiled parts at bay, all while they seep through the cracks, reshaping our lives without our permission. To deny is to repeat. This is the eternal law of the soul. What we will not face will rule us, not because it is more powerful than us, but because we have given it power by refusing to understand it. We become like puppets, acting out the same dramas, replaying the same heartbreaks, sabotaging the same dreams. The names and faces may change, but the pattern persists. Again and again, we meet ourselves in disguise, until we are brave enough to unmask the reflection. But let us be clear, this is not a call to indulgence. To own a part of yourself is not to act on every impulse or gratify every desire. Ownership is not the same as surrender. It is recognition, it is honesty, it is the willingness to say, yes, this too is me. It is the refusal to continue dividing the self into acceptable and unacceptable, worthy and unworthy, light and dark. When we say, this is mine, something changes. The compulsion begins to soften. The repetition begins to dissolve. The story begins to evolve. We are no longer haunted by what we have denied, because we have given it a place in our story. We have offered it language. We have made it human. And in doing so, we reclaim our freedom. Because freedom is not the absence of inner conflict, it is the integration of it. It is not perfection but wholeness. It is the courage to sit with discomfort and ask what it wants to teach us. It is the maturity to know that we are not made up of contradictions, but of complexities. That there is wisdom in our wounds and guidance in our guilt. The path forward is not paved with denial, but with understanding, not with rejection, but with inclusion, not with shame, but with compassion. To integrate the disowned self is to grow, not upward, away from our pain, but inward into it, to make peace with what we have been at war with, to take the exiled child by the hand and say, "You belong with me." Then, and only then, can transformation begin. The world does not need more masks. It does not need more hollow confidence or curated perfection. It needs people who have walked through their inner wilderness and come out carrying truth. People who have stopped blaming the mirror and started healing the face it reflects. People who know that the real danger is not in feeling too much, but in feeling nothing, not in being too complex, but in pretending to be simple, not in needing others, but in pretending we never did. So let us stop running. Let us stop pretending. Let us stop repeating the same old story with new actors and new stages. The time has come to tell the truth, not just the truth that flatters, but the truth that liberates, the truth that hurts and heals. The truth that says, "I am not perfect, but I am whole. I have fallen, but I rise. I have denied, but now I remember." This is the beginning of power, not the power to control others, but the power to reclaim yourself. There is a profound and unsettling truth buried deep in the soul of every human being. We are not whole. We walk the earth fragmented, split between light and shadow, between who we show to the world and who waits in silence behind the veil. And yet transformation, the kind that shakes us at our foundation and rebuilds us anew, comes not through denial, not through eradication, but through integration. The path to becoming oneself is not paved by destroying the parts of us we despise, but by embracing them, listening to their cries, and finding their rightful place in the totality of our being. To live in denial of any aspect of our psyche is to allow it dominion in secrecy. That which is exiled does not vanish, it festers. It becomes a ghost in the machine, manipulating our choices from the dark, coloring our relationships, warping our values, and stirring unrest in our quietest moments. The very impulse to cast away what we find unlovable is itself rooted in fear. Fear of judgment, fear of loss, fear of what we might become if we dared to welcome that which we've learned to hate. But consider this, you are a symphony. Not a solo instrument, not a single note, but a great orchestral masterpiece. Every emotion, every instinct, every hidden memory is an instrument with a voice of its own. Over the years, some of these instruments have been silenced. Perhaps shame muffled the voice of desire. Perhaps trauma muted the strings of grief. Perhaps guilt gagged the drumbeat of rage, but silence is not absence. These instruments still play, just beneath the surface out of tune, dissonant, wild. And the more we try to ignore them, the more chaotic they become. Now imagine what happens when you begin to listen, when, instead of suppressing the violin's shrill sorrow or the cello's deep despair, you tune them, refine them, allow them space in the grand composition of your being. Then, and only then, can there be harmony. The music of your life becomes rich, complex, and truthful, not because it is flawless, but because it is whole. There was once a woman, unremarkable in the eyes of the world, but carrying within her the storm of centuries. She had spent her life avoiding conflict like a deadly contagion. Anger, for her, was synonymous with danger. It reminded her of screaming parents, broken glass, and nights hiding in her room. So she learned to smile through pain, to nod through insult, to swallow her opinions with the bitterness of resentment. She prided herself on being nice, easygoing, and pleasant, but underneath she was boiling. Her relationships were fraught with manipulation. She cried alone and wondered why no one really saw her. In the sanctuary of therapy, she encountered her anger not as an enemy, but as a messenger. It came to her not in screams, but in whispers. I deserve to be heard. That voice, once terrifying, became her compass. She did not become cruel or confrontational. She became real. No longer did she bite her tongue when truth trembled on the edge. No longer did she smile when her heart screamed no. In integrating her anger, she became assertive, not aggressive, not submissive, authentically powerful. Her story is not rare. Every person carries such a disowned aspect. The boy who hides his sensitivity behind bravado because he was taught tears are weakness. The woman who denies her ambition because she fears she'll be unloved if she outshines others. The man who cannot rest because to be still is to feel the grief he has long buried. These hidden selves are not villains. They are wounded children locked away for too long, waiting to be met with compassion rather than condemnation. To integrate is to allow these parts to speak their truth, to let them breathe, to give them roles that serve the greater self. This is not indulgence, it is sovereignty, for as long as your inner world is at war, you are a subject to forces you do not understand. But when you gather your fragmented pieces and hold them in the light of consciousness, you become the conductor of your symphony, no longer ruled by one unruly instrument or another, but guiding them into resonance. There is immense power in welcoming home what you have most feared within yourself. That fear, deep, ancestral, is not a signal to run. It is a doorway. What you hate may indeed be the very key to your greatness. Beneath addiction may lie creativity starving for expression. Beneath jealousy, a yearning for your own potential. Beneath numbness, a depth of emotion too vast for the conscious mind to handle all at once. The darkness within you is not a void. It is a wellspring, but you must descend into it willingly, not as a victim, not as a warrior, but as a pilgrim, with reverence, with courage, with curiosity. The descent is not easy. You will meet the monsters you've painted on cave walls since childhood. You will be tempted to flee, to return to the numb comfort of disassociation. But stay, look closer. Often these monsters wear the faces of your younger selves. Selves you abandoned, misunderstood, or betrayed in your desperation to be accepted. You may weep, you may rage, you may tremble, but each encounter is a liberation. Each acknowledgement is a healing, and as you gather your scattered pieces, you begin to feel something ancient awaken within you, a sense of coherence, a grounded presence, a knowing that you are no longer at the mercy of your own mind. This is transformation, not the glossy reinvention sold to you by the world, but the raw soul, wrought metamorphosis that changes your very being, not through striving, not through erasing, but through remembering. Through welcoming, through integrating, the person you were meant to be has always been there waiting not for perfection, but for permission. The soul suffers most when it is divided against itself, and yet we are taught from an early age to disown the parts of ourselves that do not shine. To bury our confusion, our fear, our anger deep within the unconscious, hoping that if we pretend hard enough, we might finally resemble the image of perfection we hold in our minds. But this illusion, though seductive, becomes a prison. Perfection is not the path to freedom. It is the path to fragmentation. The truth, far more subtle and far more powerful, is that liberation begins with self-acceptance. Not despite our flaws, but because of them. Within every human being lies a battlefield, a place where the ego wrestles with the shadow, where the curated self struggles to silence the wounded voice within. We are trained to believe that worth is a product of achievement, and that inner peace must be earned through suffering, sacrifice, or relentless improvement. But how many more masks must we wear before we realize that the striving itself is the sickness? That the idea of being fixed is just another disguise for fear, To accept oneself is to perform an act of extraordinary courage. It is to turn toward what we've hidden, to sit beside our shame without judgment, to speak kindly to the trembling parts of our psyche that have only ever wanted to be heard. This is not passivity. This is not resignation. It is the profound act of reclaiming the totality of who we are, the light and the dark, the glorious and the grotesque. And in that reclamation, we discover something astonishing. When we stop fleeing our brokenness, we begin to feel whole. A man who accepts himself is truly unstoppable, not because he is invulnerable, but because he is no longer divided. He fears nothing within himself. He does not need to posture or pretend. He does not depend on the approval of others to validate his existence. He becomes rooted like an ancient tree, immovable not through force, but through inner harmony. The storm may rage, but he does not sway, because he no longer doubts the ground beneath him. Modern psychology echoes this eternal truth. Dr. Kristin Neff, in her pioneering work on self-compassion, has shown that those who practice acceptance are more resilient in the face of adversity. They do not crumble under failure, nor do they inflate themselves in success. They grow because they are no longer spending their energy fighting internal wars. Their mind is not a battlefield but a sanctuary, and in that sanctuary, healing begins. Consider the addict who, in his most desperate hour, uttered the words, "The moment I admitted I was broken was the first moment I began to heal." There is something sacred in that admission, something deeply human. For it is only when we surrender the performance, when we cease pretending to be what we are not, that we touch the true fabric of our soul. This man did not banish the addict within him. He listened to him. He learned from him. He took him by the hand not as a master, but as a companion. In doing so, he dethroned the demon and transformed it into a teacher. This is the alchemy of self-acceptance. The parts of us we most fear, our addictions, our regrets, our rage, are not enemies to be slain. They are messengers. They carry with them the pain we refused to feel, the wounds we never allowed to bleed. To shut them out is to shut out the possibility of transformation, but to welcome them, this is where freedom is born. We all have chapters of our story that we wish we could erase. Pages stained with failure, with betrayal, with grief, but tearing them out does not make them disappear. It only ensures that we remain haunted by their silence. To be whole is to include every chapter, to read it all, aloud if necessary, to weep over the pain and still claim it as our own, for in doing so we reclaim our agency, we take the pen back into our hands. What the world needs is not more polished people, but more honest ones, not more perfection, but more presence. The kind of presence that comes from knowing yourself so deeply that no criticism can wound you and no praise can define you. You become a mirror reflecting truth without distortion, and that kind of person, they change everything around them, not by force but by example. There is a wild, fierce love that waits on the other side of self-acceptance. It is not soft, nor is it sentimental. It is a love forged in the fires of suffering, a love that looks into the abyss and says, "I see you, and I will not turn away." This love does not require that you be perfect. It only asks that you be present, that you be real, that you bring your whole self to the altar of your life and say, "This is who I am, and that is enough." In a world obsessed with image, authenticity becomes a radical act. And the most authentic thing you can do is to stop warring with yourself. Stop judging your pain. Stop pretending that you are anything other than what you are. Stand in the center of your being, conflicted, contradictory, unfinished, and claim it. Not as a weakness, but as your greatest strength. Freedom has never been about escaping our nature. It has always been about embracing it. The paradox is that only by accepting our imperfections can we truly transcend them. Not by erasing them, but by weaving them into the tapestry of our identity. In doing so, we become real, we become whole, and in that wholeness, we find the peace we've been chasing all along. So let us stop waiting for permission to love ourselves. Let us stop believing that we need to earn our right to exist. The journey does not begin with fixing. It begins with seeing, clearly, compassionately, fiercely. And in that seeing, in that sacred turning inward, we rediscover what has always been ours, the power to be free. So I ask you now, what do you hate in yourself? What part of you do you run from? Because until you stop running, you will become the very thing you fear. But if you turn, face it, speak to it, you will not be consumed, you will be transformed. This is not a message of despair, it is a call to courage. The parts of you that you most hate are not your enemies, they are exiled kings waiting to come home. So bring them home, not tomorrow, now, thank you.